Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We'll be talking with Sara Lazar. Sara Lazar PhD is an associate researcher in the Psychiatric Department at Massachusetts General Hospital and an assistant professor in psychology at Harvard Medical School. In this talk, Sara Lazar will go into discussion with these leading questions. How does meditation impact the brain? And how does this, in turn, lead to improved ability to deal with pain and fear? With that being said, Sara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me today. As you were just told, I'm going to talk about meditation in the brain, and we're going to focus on pain and fear. And then if there's time at the end, I'll also talk a little bit about healthy cognitive aging. First, we're going to talk about mindfulness. So what is mindfulness meditation? So the most common definition of mindfulness is purposely paying attention to experience in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. And I like this cartoon because it really helps convey this concept. So you see these two women, they're both walking in the forest. One woman is completely tuned in to what she's actually seeing and experiencing, so the trees, the sunlight, versus the other woman is completely oblivious to both of these and instead is thinking about her job, her family, all the chores she has to do, all her worries. And so this idea that, although you're both doing the exact same thing, experiencing the exact same phenomena, what you pay attention to can be very, very different. And so mindfulness is just this present moment awareness. And lots of times people say, okay, well, they hear about mindfulness, they hear about meditation. Are they the same? Are they different? So it's important to notice here that neither of these people are meditating, right? And so this is the thing about mindfulness is it's a skill that anyone can do anytime, anywhere. But just like any other skill, it's easier to do it when you're sitting quietly alone and only doing one thing at a time versus when you have to go out in the world and do other things. And the goal of mindfulness meditation is to strengthen that skill so that you can be mindful 24/7, regardless of what you're doing. And so it's a very simple skill. It's just being aware of the present moment. But when you're faced with all the stresses of the day, it can be very difficult to do. So we practice the mindfulness by meditating to strengthen that skill. The key element of that definition is the last part of it, the non-judging. Lots of times people get tripped up with that aspect of it. I prefer the word equanimity, the idea being that you're open to experience and it's all more or less equal, that you can see, seeing everything without, getting too wrapped up or too attached to any particular outcome. And the idea is that it's open, so it's not indifference, but it's this very non-reactive. It's like, okay, this is happening right now. So mindfulness meditation. So that's mindfulness. What's mindfulness meditation? Mindfulness meditation is so you sit and you meditate, but you're doing it in this open, relaxed, curious way where you're just open to whatever's experiencing right now. And typically people focus on either breathing sensations or body sensations or sensory stimuli such as sounds. Breathing sensation is the most common, but really you can pick anything you want in your experience. And then you just do this for 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes a day. And the key thing is that you're very much in the present moment. So you're not spaced out, you're not lost in thought, and you're not in a trance state, right? And the key thing is that as you're being aware of all these different stimuli, that you have this equanimous, non-judging attitude. So now, about 40 years ago or so, a man named John Kabat-Zinn realized that mindfulness meditation could be potentially very useful in clinical contexts. And so he's one of the first people to sort of separate meditation from the Eastern religions from which they are derived and to teach them in a completely secular way in clinical contexts. And he created a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, or MBSR. And most of the research I'm going to show you today uses MBSR or a closely related program. And these programs have been proven to be highly effective for reducing stress as well as other conditions. So they're 8-week group interventions. There's a weekly class in which you actually practice meditation for 40 minutes. And then you also get a little bit of stress education and sort of learn about how to use meditation and mindfulness, in everyday life. Very importantly, you're also given recordings and told to practice every day at home for 40 minutes. And there's 3 different types of practices. So one is a body scan where you just very slowly move your attention through your body over the course of 40 minutes and just noticing what does your body actually feel like. Another one is very gentle yoga. So this is not the type of yoga you typically get at a gym. It's more as you raise your arms, how do you know your arms are moving? How do you know where your arms are? What does it actually feel like as your arms move in space? Like what's the actual felt sensation? And then the third one is just open awareness of the present moment. And again, each of those you would do for 40 minutes a day, over the course of the 8 weeks. And a big, very important part of the course is also to really encourage people to have anytime mindfulness. And so that is, if you're walking through the forest, or even if you're just walking, say, from your house to your car, can you put aside your everyday thoughts and just be in the present moment as you're walking for those, 10 seconds to get from your door to your car? Or when you're talking with people, or as you're washing dishes, can you just find a few minutes throughout the day, or a few moments throughout the day, where you're just intentionally mindful, and all of these help increase the likelihood of mindfulness happening spontaneously on its own. There's been several thousand studies now demonstrating that it's effective for reducing stress, both self-reported aspects of stress, but also things like cortisol, inflammation, and various biomarkers related to stress. It's also associated with reduced symptoms of depression, anxiety, pain, and insomnia. Other conditions as well, but I'd like to highlight these 4 because they're so prevalent, both by themselves, and also they're so prevalent when people have other conditions. So even if people have, say, heart disease or diabetes, often there's anxiety, depression, pain, or insomnia, at least one of these. And we know that these can have negative consequences on other conditions. So by reducing these, you can have positive impacts on other conditions. There's also growing awareness that's not just good, or not only good for just reducing stress and the bad stuff, it also increases the good stuff. So people feel happier, more connected, more joyful, more compassionate, and just also increased quality of life. So there's a lot of even though nothing in their life is changing, they're reporting being more satisfied with their life. So there's really a lot of really positive benefits to this. It's not just about stress. So when I first started practicing yoga back 30 years ago, almost now, very quickly things started to change for me. Like I was less stressed, more aware, more relaxed, and more, I was starting to experience some of these things after just a few weeks of practice. So to me, it suggested that something was changing in my brain. Like I knew somehow I was experiencing the world in a new way. So I was really curious. So I started doing research on this, and I'm going to share some of that research on you today. And so the first question was, can we actually change the structure of the brain? And so what we did was we took people, so we knew these 8-week courses were really effective for reducing stress. And people go through those programs and say, oh my God, this program changed my life. So we said, okay, does it also change your brain? So we put people in an MRI scanner right before they went through one of these 8-week programs, and again, right after they finished it. And we compared them to people who we scanned 8 weeks apart, but who were not going through the program. And they went through the program after the 8 weeks. And we see that there were definitely some brain regions where there was more gray matter at the end of the 8 weeks compared to the control group. What are these brain regions? So this area is called the posterior cingulate, the supramarginal gyrus, and the hippocampus. The posterior cingulate, it's involved in seeing how is this relevant to me. And whenever people talk about the self in relationship to the brain, the posterior cingulate is the #1 region that typically gets implicated. This is also one of the regions that's most strongly implicated in Alzheimer's disease. The supramarginal gyrus, it's involved in perspective taking. So being able to see things from other people's point of view. but it's also involved in am I paying attention to my internal world or my external world? And then finally, we have the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. And like the posterior cingulate, it's also very strongly degraded in people with Alzheimer's disease. What's interesting is that these three regions together comprise something called the default mode network. And what that is when we put people in the MRI scanner and you just have them lie there and do nothing, you would expect that everybody's brain activity would be completely random. And although that's kind of sort of true, what's interesting is that these three brain regions, along with two or three others, are typically the regions that are most active. And that there's a certain pattern that we tend to see in all people when they're just lying there doing nothing in particular. And this is why it's called the default mode network. And so it's the idea is that these are the brain regions that are most related to the self. And because typically when you're lying there not thinking about anything particular, you tend to think about things that are relevant to you, like, oh, I need to go, pick up some groceries on my way home tonight, or you conversations with friends and relatives. That we tend to think about highly personal, salient things when we're lying there doing nothing. And so that's what we're seeing is that these are the brain regions involved in this. And so it's sort of interesting that these are the regions that are most changing with meditation practice. And we know from other research that these regions all get shut off while people are meditating, and that the connections between them become altered with meditation practice. And I'll show you some of that research in a little bit. And so what we think here is that these changes in gray matter are supporting this, that they're both turning them down and changing the connections between them. Another thing we found was that the amygdala got smaller and that the change in the amygdala correlated with changes in stress. So the more stress reduction people reported, the smaller their amygdala became. And this is really important because up until this point, lots of times critics will say, well, it's been 2 months. People are saying they're less stressed because whatever was stressing them out at the beginning is gone, right? Or it's just placebo, or there's all sorts of reasons why people might say they're feeling less stressed, but couldn't be real. But this really suggests that no, the change in stress was correlated with a change in the amygdala. And this has been replicated now several times, and also showing that the wiring of the amygdala changes in just 8 weeks. And so there's this neurobiological reason why people are saying that they're less stressed. Finally, what we found was here in the brainstem. And this is a part of the brainstem that is responsible for releasing dopamine and serotonin to the rest of the brain. And what we found here was that the change here correlated with well-being, so how satisfied people were with their life. And this was just 8 weeks, so nothing about their life had changed, but yet they're reporting being more satisfied with their life, and it's correlating with this area that we know is regulating serotonin and dopamine, which are the main mood molecules in the brain. So we didn't measure those molecules in this study, but it's suggestive that, okay, this may be part of the reason why people have these positive benefits. All right, so that was stress. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about pain, and then we'll talk about anxiety and fear. So in this study, so first of all, let's talk a little bit about pain and how pain works in the brain in general. So you stub your toe or you burn your finger, and the noxious signal comes in, and this is your brainstem, and then this is the brain, so here's your eyeball. So the painful stimulus comes in, and it would go up into the brain, and then this blue network is the network of brain regions that processes the pain. And there's two components to pain. One component of pain is the actual burning, stinging, stabbing sensation. And the other component of pain is the emotional component. Ouch, that hurts. I don't like it. Make it stop. And we know that those are separate in the brain and that they are different for each person. So all of us could, burn our finger on the stove and feel the same thing in terms of the burning sensation, but how we respond to that pain would be very, very different. And that's because, again, they're in two separate systems. There have been a lot of studies of pain control. So there's, for instance, you can distract people or, direct their attention away from the painful sensation. You can modify expectation by saying, oh, like when the doctor says, oh, I'm going to give you a shot, but it's not going to hurt. Or with placebo, you can give people a cream and put cream on the surface of the skin and say there's something in this cream that's going to block the pain. And what's interesting is all three of these look pretty much the same in the brain. What happens is that the front of the brain, which is the executive part of the brain, shuts down the signal. So you burn your finger or you stub your toe and the signal comes up, but then it stops and it doesn't get processed. So you never actually feel the sensation of the burning or the stabbing or whatnot. And like I said, all three of these do the same thing. The front of the brain turns on and shuts off this sensory network. So the question was, what about meditation? So what we did is we put people in the MRI scanner and we applied a very mild electric shock to their hand. And we did this periodically over a 40-second period. And then we had them rate both the intensity of the stinging sensation and also the unpleasantness of it. And we had them do it first in a normal state and then in a mindful state. And we did this both with meditators and controls. And so the controls, we just told them what mindfulness was 5 minutes before they went in the scanner. And so, they did their best to be mindful while they were in the scanner. So what do we see? So here's the front of the brain. Here's the back of the brain, the right and the left. So what we see here, this is the front of brain. So this is what we know with other forms of pain control. This gets turned on. And in the controls, that's exactly what we saw, that relative to the normal state, that they're in their mindful state, when they're trying to be mindful, this region got turned on. But in the meditation practitioners, this region got turned off. Conversely, this is sensory cortex. In the controls, it got turned off. In the meditation practitioners, it actually got turned on even more. So let's pause here and think about this. What's going on here? So for the controls, it's looking like other forms of pain control, right? So we're turning on the front of the brain and turning off sensory cortex, right? So that looks like all other forms of pain control. But for the meditation practitioners, it's the exact opposite. You're turning off the control in the front of the brain, and instead you're turning up sensory cortex. So at first there's a bit of a head scratcher, but then we thought about what is the definition of mindfulness? Mindfulness is paying attention to sensory experience in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So this is exactly what we're seeing. We told them to be mindful, which means we told them pay attention to it, but do it in this non-judging, non-controlling way. So this is equanimity, right? They're turning off the control, off the judging, and instead just turning on sensory experience of the present moment in this open, non-judging way. And then in terms of their ratings, what we see is that for the intensity, so just how much it was a stinging or burning sensation, was the same under both conditions, but the unpleasantness, there was a significant decrease. So although they were feeling it more, the mindfulness practitioners said that it just didn't bother them. So they were there, they're turning off the control, they were just really feeling it, but it wasn't bothering them. Right, so this is equanimity. Right. Okay, so our first quote of the day: life is painful, suffering is optional. Right, and this is really important because no matter how much you meditate, you're still going to occasionally stub your toe or burn your finger, and things that are unpleasant are going to happen. Right, we cannot avoid the pain of life, but what we can control is how we respond to those pains. And that's really what we're learning with the mindfulness. By constantly just practicing being aware of whatever's happening in this open, curious, non-judging way, we really reinforce that attitude. And so it spills over into all aspects of our life. All right, so now we're going to talk about anxiety and fear. This is one of my favorite experiments, which I actually didn't do. This is a group out at, they're now at UCSD. What they did is they gave people an anxiety questionnaire right before they went into the MRI scanner. They put them in the MRI scanner and had them meditate, and then they took them out again and gave them the anxiety questionnaire again. And what they found was that brain activity in these brain regions, which are during the meditation in the scanner, correlated with the amount of anxiety reduction from before to after the scan. So this was our PCC, right? I told you this is one of the areas that gets turned off. So blue means getting turned off. And then here's the insula. This is one of the regions that gets turned on during meditation. And also this is another sensory region that's getting turned on. So these sensory regions are getting turned on, and the more they get turned on, the more anxiety reduction people reported from before to after just being in the scanner for 5 or 10 minutes. So that's really, again, sort of like a direct example of, okay, you really can get these benefits very, very quickly. So that's just a momentary anxiety. What about something a little bit more, we're going to up the stakes a little bit. So what we know is that mindfulness-based interventions are really effective for reducing anxiety, all sorts of anxiety. So general anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, and PTSD. And the way typically these conditions are handled in psychotherapy is something called exposure therapy, where whatever it is that you are anxious about, basically the idea is that, okay, you just keep exposing yourself to it over and over and over again until you sort of lose the fear of it. So for instance, if you were afraid of, say, insects, you might start off by seeing like cartoon drawings of insects, and then maybe photographs of insects, and then they actually bring in insects into the therapy room. They do this slowly over time, so you just get used to the idea of, okay, there's an insect right there. And so the idea was that mindfulness is all about being open to experience in this non-judging way. And so because of that, we thought, okay, so mindfulness should be an optimal form of exposure therapy. Right? It should help enhance exposure. And so the question is, can we actually demonstrate that? So what we did is an experimental version of this. And so I'll explain in a minute exactly what we did. But what we did is we did a fear conditioning protocol, right? So we actually gave people electric shocks. I'll explain that in a moment. And then we put them through this 8-week program, this 8-week MBSR program, and we compared it to exercise. And then we did it again at the end. And we deliberately chose to randomize people to mindfulness or to exercise because the question was, so, all these studies have shown that meditation is good for stress, but we know other things are good for stress too, and in particular, exercise. Exercise is great for reducing stress. So is it the same, or does it work through different mechanisms? And so everyone was told that there was no control group, which is true because we know that exercise is effective for reducing stress, and that both groups are beneficial. And the exercise group also got information about like diet and sleep and positive attitude and humor. And both groups were told to practice for 40 minutes a day at home. So the MBSR group, they practiced meditation for 40 minutes a day at home. The exercise group were given exercise videos and TheraBands and some other like exercise balls and told to practice for 40 minutes a day at home. And everybody recorded how much they practiced. And we found is that both groups reduced stress, right? Because this SME is the control group, and they reduced stress equally well, which again is what we expected because we know that exercise is very good for reducing stress. And we also found that the amount people practice correlated with stress. So the more they practice, the more stress reduction they reported, which again is very important. So it's you have to practice in order to benefit. All right, so what do we actually do? How do we induce their stress? So you all have heard of Pavlovian conditioning, right? So normally a dog salivates when they see a bone or get food, but they don't salivate when they hear bells. If every time you give the dog food, you ring a bell, then they learn the bell means I'm getting food. And so eventually you can ring the bell and they salivate even if you don't give them food. So we're going to do the same thing, but instead of giving them food, we're going to give them a mild electric shock. And instead of ringing bells, we're going to show them lights. And it looks something like this. So again, we put them in the MRI scanner, we give them the shock to the hand again, but this time they see different colored lights while they're getting shocked. And what it looks like is this. So we showed them 3 different colored lights, red, yellow, and blue. When they see the red light and the yellow light, they get shocked. When they see the blue light, they don't get shocked. So they learn red and yellow means I'm going to get shocked. And then I'm going to talk about the rest of this in a little bit. But first of all, we're just going to look at this data. And so we saw this is skin conductance, which is a measure of how frightened people are. And so the red is the reaction to the red light, and the blue is a reaction to the blue lights. And so what you can see is that, yeah, when they're getting shocked, they have a much bigger skin conductance because, hey, I'm getting shocked. This is at baseline for both groups. So both groups, when they get shocked, they have a very big reaction to being shocked compared to seeing the light that doesn't know getting shocked. After training, though, we see a big difference. So for the controls, what do we see? There's still some reaction to being shocked, but not much. Versus in the MBSR group, they're looking more or less like they did at baseline. So you might think, okay, what's going on here? But let's think about, because of course the shock is painful. And we know from that first study that the controls, they're probably employing these other forms of pain control, and they're stopping the signal from coming up, and so they're just not feeling it, right? And so they're avoiding it, and they're trying to control the pain. Versus MBSR, if they're just being open and saying, okay, I'm being shocked, no big deal, then this is what we expect to see, right? So again, this is equanimity, that even though they know they're going to get shocked, they're just lying there and saying, okay, I'm going to get shocked, that's okay. And we know that this is a good interpretation of this, because what we found is that there was a change in the amygdala, and the change in the amygdala correlated with this. So the more pre and post look the same, the bigger the change in the amygdala, versus the more pre and post look different, the smaller the change in the amygdala. And also in self-reported stress. So again, the more people reported stress reduction, the more pre and post look the same. And then the less stress reduction people reported, the more pre and post look different. So it really does suggest that being open to very painful stimuli and just saying it's okay is really effective for stress reduction. Okay, so that's the first part. So now what about the second part? So as I mentioned, we did this, and then what we did is we showed them the red light, but we didn't shock them. And we also showed them the blue light again, but we didn't show them the yellow light. So first they learn red light means I'm gonna get shocked. Then they learn red light means I'm safe. They go home, they come back the next day, and we show them all three lights, and we don't shock them again. And we ask, how do they respond to the red light compared to how they respond to the yellow light? And it's been shown that people with anxiety disorders forget that red light means I'm safe. And so for people with anxiety disorders, red light and yellow look more similar, versus people who don't have anxiety disorders, red light and blue light look more similar, right? And the idea is, and we know this has to do with the hippocampus, because again, the hippocampus is all about remembering and learning. And so the idea is that because they are not able to remember that red light means safe, that's why they look more like the yellow light. And so what we found is that indeed there was a group difference. So in the meditation group, there was a significant improvement in their ability to remember that red light means I'm safe, versus in the control groups, there was no learning over the course of the 8 weeks. And this was a significant group difference. And so then we said, okay, well, what's going on in the brain? So we knew both groups changed the hippocampus, but the question was, well, how are they talking to the brain differently? And what we found was that the meditation group had increased activity in the hand area. So here it is. This is day 2. They're not actually being shocked. But what they're paying attention to is their hand, right? So even though they're not being shocked, they're just chilling out and paying attention to the hand. Versus the controls, this is visual cortex. The controls were paying attention to the colored lights. And previously, it's been shown that activity here during this task is correlated with anxiety. And indeed, we found that as well. The more people activated this region, the more anxiety they reported, or the smaller the change in anxiety. So the more this was active, the more anxiety at post, and the more this was turned off, the more anxiety reduction they reported at post. So it suggests that their ability to switch and pay attention and just chill out and pay attention to their hand versus looking at the lights and being anxious about, okay, what light's coming up next and am I going to get shocked or not? That's what's happening with meditation practice. The other change we found was here, the supramarginal gyrus. This is the same region I showed you changes in structure after 8 weeks. And again, we saw that this change is larger in the mindfulness group compared to the controls. And again, this is the region that's involved in, do I pay attention to my internal world or my external world? And so again, this is consistent. And this correlated with practice time. So the more people practice, the more this changed. So again, putting this all together, we had this idea that the more you practice, the more you're able to control and engage this region that says, what do I pay attention to? And with the meditation practice, you pay attention to your hand versus, and you just chill out, versus the controls are not able to control that. And instead they're paying attention to the visual stimuli and trying to figure out what's going on. And this is related to more anxiety. So the conclusion from this part of the talk is that mindfulness of the body is key for both pain and fear, right? Because in both cases, what we're seeing is that they're just paying attention to their sensory experience and they're not freaking out about it. And that what's happening is that we're shifting from thinking about and defending against threat to experiencing it openly and with equanimity. And so a quote from meditation master Thich Nhat Hanh, who died about a year or so ago, he says, meditation is not evasion. It is a serene encounter with reality, right? And so this is really one of the key lessons of mindfulness meditation is that, sometimes people think, oh, you're meditating and, you're off in la la land and, that's not the case. That mindfulness is really being in the present moment and being in it in a very new and different way, and in a way that, it doesn't matter what's going on around you, can we embrace it and be okay with it regardless of what's going on. Okay, that's part one of the talk. So now we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about successful cognitive aging. So, why are we going to talk about that? There's a couple of reasons why. So mindfulness meditation, so what I've shown you so far has to do with the last part of that definition, the without judgment, right? So we're paying attention without judgment. But the key thing is also we're paying attention. And so a lot of people have hypothesized that meditation could be thought of as a form of mental training. And because what you have to do is, so say you're paying attention to breathing sensations, it's pretty boring. Minds start to wander. And so every time your mind starts to wander, you have to say, wait, hold on, my mind is wandering, and you bring it back. And then shortly after that, the mind starts to wander again. Oh, got to bring it back again. So it really is a form of sustained attention. Also, there's something called meta-awareness, which is awareness of what you're aware of, right? And so it's sort of stepping back and sort of seeing your thinking process. And so you're really strengthening that as well, right? Because you have to be paying attention to, okay, now I'm paying attention to the breath, and oh, wait, hold on, my mind's starting to wander, and I need to bring it back. And of course, you also have to remember to have this non-judging, open attitude. So again, this has been called mental training. And so there's been a variety of studies demonstrating that, yeah, in addition to impacting stress and pain and anxiety, it also has improvements in memory and attention and mental flexibility. But not much is known about the neural correlates of this. So we want to do a study about that. So, and we're particularly interested in something called fluid intelligence. So there's different types of intelligence. One is crystallized intelligence, the other is fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is just all the information that you have. Fluid intelligence is being able to take information and solve problems. And what's interesting is that crystallized intelligence pretty much increases with age, versus fluid intelligence peaks in our 20s, and then it's all downhill from there, unfortunately. The rate of this goes down at different rates for different people, but basically it still goes down. And we know fluid intelligence is comprised of sustained attention, working memory, metacognition, and other executive functions. And so given that we know that meditation has a positive impact on these three, we wondered, well, okay, could meditation impact fluid intelligence? Also, one of the first studies I did is we looked at long-term meditation practitioners versus controls. And we found that this brain region was bigger in long-term meditators versus control. And this is the area that's most associated with fluid intelligence. So here, this is in red, this is the controls, the blue is the meditators. And as I mentioned, fluid intelligence peaks in our 20s, and then it's all downhill from there. And that's also true for the whole front of our brain, that as we get older, our brain shrinks. But we saw here in this one region is that for the controls, it shrunk, as it's been reported to do many times. But for the meditation practitioners, they were the same thickness as the 25-year-olds, suggesting that meditation maybe had preserved the thickness of this brain region for the meditation practitioners. And so the question was, okay, well, it's preserving the brain, does it also preserve cognition? So we repeated the study, and this time we gave them the standard test of fluid intelligence. And I should say fluid intelligence is the fancy name for IQ. And what we see here is that the controls, with age, their fluid intelligence went down. Again, this is well documented in many, many, many studies. Versus meditation practitioners and also long-term yoga practitioners, it was relatively speaking preserved with age. So there is some decrease with age, but for the most part, it's preserved. And I should mention everyone was matched for age, education, and race. So it wasn't anything like that. There was a difference between the three groups. So this study, though, was long-term practitioners. And so the question was, well, people who've been practicing a long time, they're different. They eat their diet's different. There could be something else about that's different. Also, the big question was, well, that's good for people who've been practicing for 20 years, but what about people who are already older? Can we teach older adults, to meditate, and will it help them in later life? So to address that, what we did was we recruited 120 healthy older adults. Everyone was 65 to 80 years old, and we gave them a standard test of cognition, and anyone with even the slightest hint of dementia was ruled out. So these were very healthy, normal people. And they had no prior meditation or yoga experience. And we randomized them to either mindfulness or brain games. So the brain games were crossword puzzles, Sudoku, word search, word jumbles, things like this. Everyone went through an 8-week program, and in class, they either practiced meditation for 40 minutes or they did brain games together as a group together for 40 minutes. And then everyone was told to practice for 40 minutes a day at home. And they were tested at baseline, end of program, and at 12 and 24 months program end. And what we saw was that relative to the cognitive fitness training, that from pre to post, the meditation training had a much larger impact on memory and executive functionings. And this is like sort of a standard test of it's like a battery of tests that assess different aspects of mental functioning that's given in the context of aging. And so the meditation had a bigger impact. And also what we saw was that this change was related to changes in the connections of the brain. And this was only seen in the meditation practitioners. So again, we have here this area sort of in the back of the brain, and these regions involved in attention and directing attention, and that these were much greater in the meditation practitioners compared to the controls. We also found, we gave them the standard test of fluid intelligence, and we saw is that both groups from pre to post had increases, because again, it's well known that doing things like crossword puzzles and Sudoku and whatnot, they will give you short-term bumps. But at 12 months post-training, the controls lost the initial bump. And again, this is well documented that these brain games, they're good for short time, but then they're short-lived. Versus what was interesting is in the meditation practice, the benefits not only were they maintained, but they continued to accrue over the course of the next 12 months. And we also found this for attention. So what this was a very boring attention task where for 16 minutes, they had to, they saw pictures of either cities or mountains. And they were shown these pictures, I think it was like about every half a second, they would see a picture, and they'd have to say, if they saw a city, they'd click a button and say, yes, it's the city. But if it was a mountain scene, they wouldn't click the button. And 90% of the pictures were cities. So 90% of the time they were clicking, but every so often they'd see that mountain, so they'd have to withhold their click. And they did this for 16 minutes, and it gets pretty boring. So everyone's pretty good initially, but then over the course of the 16 minutes, performance drops off. So what do we see? So from pre to post, again, both groups improve from pre to post. But over the next 2 years, the controls gradually lost their performance. They didn't go back to baseline, but they didn't maintain what they gained. Versus again, the meditators continue to improve over the 2 years. What was interesting is that when we looked at it and broke it down a little bit more. So here's the meditation group. So this is the 16 minutes of city, mountain, city, and whatnot. And what you can see is that, as I mentioned, that over the course of the 16 minutes, performance goes down. And this is baseline performance. At post, at 2 months, again, you see pretty much the same thing. The overall, their performance is better, but that they still get the decrement over the 16 minutes. But at 1 year and 2 years, what we're seeing is that their performance over the 16 minutes is preserved, right? And so when you look at the slope, there's a difference in the slope. So they're better able to maintain. So it's not only an overall increase initially, but it's that they're able to maintain it over the 16 minutes. When we look at the controls, we don't see that at all. So in all 4 time points, you very rapidly get this decrease in performance. And then, it's then just continues to be bad over the course of the 16 minutes. So they're not able to maintain their abilities. There's initial, because, I'm going to pay attention now, but they're not able to sustain that initial burst of, okay, I got to pay attention now for more than a minute or two. So it really does suggest that there's something really inherently different about meditation training compared to crossword puzzles and Sudoku. And so with that, and so again, you can see there's no difference in the slope. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you, and we have some time for questions. And so I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Our first question is from Colin. Are the differences between mindful practitioners and controls significant in the hand shock experiments? Looks like maybe they were about the same within the errors.
No, those with the red and blue bars. That was, I think at baseline they were the same, but then at post they were very, very, very different. Unless we're talking about the second one, I guess I'm not completely sure. So no, at least at post there were differences. They had similarities in terms of stress reduction, but in terms of the brain activity and the response to the shock, they were very, very different at post.
The next question is from Sam.
Uh-huh.
Can you give any firm recommendations on the time of day that a meditation practice would be most effective?
Anytime that works for your schedule. So if you go to, the Eastern traditions, lots of times they'll say, so backing up. Many meditation and yoga traditions say that the best time of day to practice is first thing in the morning. And for some people that is true, right? And that there's also this idea that 4 a.m. is the absolute best time of day to practice. And so, if you're, say, a monk and you're going to bed, early and you're just sitting and meditating all day, then yeah, getting up at 4 a.m. to practice makes sense. But for most of us who have a normal busy day, that's not going to happen, right? Unless you really make radical changes in your practice. So why is 4 a.m. ideal? If everything else is going on. So what we know is that we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic system in our bodies, right? So we have the fight or flight and the rest and relax system in our bodies. And from approximately 4 a.m. to 4 p.m., the fight or flight is more active. And then from 4 p.m. to 4 a.m., the rest and digest system is more active. And it pretty reliably shifts. This is why, you get the 4 o'clock munchies and guys get the 5 o'clock shadow, is because we're getting these shifts in between which of these two systems is dominant. And so what happens is at 4 a.m., this is also why often if you're going to wake up in the middle of the night, it's often around 4 a.m., you need to go to the bathroom and whatnot, is because around 4 a.m. is when your brain starts waking up, right? And this is when you start having REM sleep and whatnot. And you actually get bursts of cortisol and other waking up hormones starting around 4 a.m. And then, it takes some time, you're sleeping until 6 or 7. But, if you're dedicating your life to meditation and you're just meditating all day and you're shifting your schedule and whatnot, then that's a great time to wake up and meditate because you're getting that burst of cortisol. So you have a very awake, a very alert mind at 4 a.m. Obviously, if you're going to bed at midnight or 11, you're going to be still pretty groggy at 4 a.m. But for a lot of people, if they really are shifting their schedules, then 4 a.m. is a good time to practice. But for the rest of us, that's not really relevant. I sort of think of it sort of like you know the elite swimmers and bikers who like will shave their body because the hair on their body it produces drag. They don't want the drag on their and so they'll shave the hair off, right? So that's sort of equivalent to waking up at 4 a.m. And so for the rest of us, like I said, whatever time of day works for you. For me, actually, 4 p.m. is the best time for me to meditate. Some people practice right at bed before they go to bed at night. Some people I know really need to have their coffee first thing in the morning before they can meditate. Other people like it before their coffee. I know some people who meditate 2 or 3 times throughout the day. So it's basically whatever fits into your schedule and what works for you.
Next question is by Amy.
Mm-hmm.
During the past several years, the time of COVID, some people spent more time alone and found new purpose and direction in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Many others experienced greater anxiety. Has
Yeah.
your research gone in any new directions because of COVID's impact on our society?
Mine is not. Other people has. Just because I had a couple things going, and uh, you know, we thought about doing something with COVID, but in the end, we decided not to, just because well, partly because we didn't get funding, and also we just we didn't think we had a good angle for what we could do. Um, but certainly, yeah, there was obviously a huge increase in anxiety, huge increases in isolation, and meditation definitely seems to help. It was really clear a lot of people started meditating during the pandemic. I know Headspace, which is one of the main apps, their subscriptions went through the roof during the pandemic. And so it's because we were stressed, it makes sense. And so our research has not per se gone that direction, but definitely other people's have.
Next question is by Elaine. After the 8 weeks, did the people follow up with their training for a year or do none of it?
Right. So there have been, as I mentioned, well, there's been thousands of studies, but there's also who've looked at pre-post. There's also now probably several hundred studies that have looked at some period following training. Some it's just a few months training, some it's a year or 2 years, 3 years. Typically what we see in most studies is that typically somewhere between 25 to 40% of people continue practicing at least 3 or 4 times a week. And then another 10, 20, 30% will practice at least once a week. But that, yeah, typically, again, like 30, 40% of the people completely stop practicing and never practice again. And what's interesting is that even for people who stop practicing, sometimes they'll still report the benefits, which is really interesting because, again, sometimes it's kind of sort of like some of the benefits of meditation are kind of like education in that once you know 2 + 2 = 4, even if you never do addition again, you remember 2 + 2 = 4, right? And so sometimes what happens with a meditation is you get a new perspective on why you're stressed out. And once you got that, you know that you got that, right? But there is definitely benefit to meditating every day and to sort of reducing your stress every day. And so it seems like some benefit continues regardless of whether or not you practice, but other benefits you lose if you don't continue practicing. But we haven't really parsed out exactly, okay, this is kept, but this isn't kept, or how much you need to practice in order to maintain. But definitely, yeah, typically, like I said, about 30% of people continue practicing, at least to some extent, after the 8 weeks ends.
Lily asks, how frequently do you need to meditate to make real psychological changes? And how persistent are these changes if one were to stop meditating?
Right. So again, great questions. So um, it gets sort of like exercise, right? The more you practice, the more you're going to benefit. But it seems like there definitely have been studies demonstrating that even 5 or 10 minutes a day can produce real benefits. In fact, so the Headspace app, right, is they did a couple studies with. I've seen studies with medical residents and some other like really working adults, whatnot, and giving them just 10 minutes a day that they were, and it had benefits on their stress and some other psychological measures. Just 10 minutes a day for, in some cases, just like a month or two, they could see changes. So yeah, you don't have to practice 40 minutes a day, but like exercise, the more you practice, the more benefit you're going to get. And so, for instance, like we actually did a study where we randomized people to either 10 minutes a day or 40 minutes a day. And definitely the 40 minutes a day group had more benefit, even though the 10 minutes a day group had better compliance. So the 10 minutes a day group was meditating every day for 10 minutes versus the 40 minutes a day. They were only practicing like 3 or 4 times a week, but they still had more benefit. So again, and there's not been a whole lot of studies like that. So it's hard to say exactly like, okay, and it may be dependent on what exactly you're trying to change. It may be that some symptoms 10 minutes a day is okay, but other symptoms you need 30 or 40 minutes. Um, and again, probably there's a lot of individual variability. It may be that some people just need a month, other people might need 2 or 3 or 4 months. Some people need ongoing practice. So, but like I said, there's some things that definitely can be benefited. There are definitely some long-term benefits, even if you do stop. So
Eva asks, have you looked at the effect of breath work on the brain?
we have not. That's not completely true. It's hard. You can't. It's really hard to do breathing exercises in the MRI scanner for technical reasons because it changes blood flow, and that our signal is very dependent on blood flow. And so we've not done a whole lot with that. There have been a few little studies with it, and definitely, yeah, there's benefits, or there's definitely it makes changes. But there isn't. I don't know that I can say a whole lot specifically about it. But yeah, definitely, it's there's benefits for that.
Bradley asks, are there similarities between mindfulness and prayer, regardless of the person's religious background?
Good question. Um, so again, it's sort of like exercise in that you know, all forms of exercise has general benefits, but like weight training versus cardio versus golf, there's going to be different muscles um, exercised, and like you're going to get different strength in different muscle groups depending on what sort of exercise you do, right? And there might be subtle differences in some things. Like weight training is really good for bones versus cardio maybe less so or whatever. So and so there again, there hasn't been a whole lot of research on this, but there does seem to be um, there's some overlap, but there's also some unique. And so but there hasn't been enough research to say, okay, well, that what's different makes a difference or not, right? And so we just don't know. And so definitely, there have been studies showing that prayer is beneficial, but I don't think anyone's ever done a head-to-head study saying like randomizing people to prayer or meditation. To say, okay, here's so they both seem to be generally beneficial, but there's not enough known to say exactly how they're similar or different.
Ellen asks, some people are more resilient to stress than others. How does this factor into meditation and stress reduction?
Yeah, no, definitely. So typically in our studies, we recruit people who are specifically seeking stress reduction. So, therefore, high stress people or people who are pretty resilient to stress probably would not be signing up for our studies. Um, and so, and we do that because we want to be able to see change. Because if people are already pretty good, then we're not going to see much change. But for instance, in the last study I showed with the aging, we didn't impact with that. We didn't ask for high stress. For that one, we just said, hey, brain training, improve your cognition. And so in that group, we didn't really assess stress, and we didn't give them stress reduction per se, but we still saw benefits. But again, we didn't assess the stress. So so you can benefit from meditation if you're not stressed, for sure. And um, uh, I would say, for people who are already resilient, it might provide some additional resilience, maybe. As I mentioned, there's been more and more studies showing it's good for things like sort of compassion and altruism and these sorts of things. And so, definitely, even if you're not stressed, there can be benefits for the practice that are beyond just stress reduction.
Next question says, can you elaborate on the type of yoga mentioned in the presentation?
Yeah. So That particular study were people who practice primarily Kripalu yoga. So out in Western Massachusetts, Kripalu is a large yoga facility and wellness training facility. And most of the people were either certified yoga teachers or they had, because Kripalu long ago was an actual ashram, and so some of the people who had lived in there while it was an ashram. But most of the people were actually certified teachers in the Kripalu tradition. And Kripalu is a very slow, gentle, mindful form of yoga. We deliberately wanted one that we knew was fairly a little more authentic and a little less about exercise than you get at gyms.
Next question is, would other types of meditation, such as premortal sound meditation or guided meditation, have similar benefits for anxiety and fear reduction and successful cognitive aging?
Right. So again, this sort of gets back to like the exercise analogy. That probably yes, all forms of meditation, yoga, tai chi as well, these sorts of things, they're all going to have general beneficial effects, but we don't know yet, like, okay, maybe this one is a little bit better for anxiety, and this one's a little bit better for depression, and this one's a little bit for cognition. We're not there yet.
And last question would be, what recommendations do you have for practicing trauma-informed mindfulness?
Yeah. So working with a really good teacher and working with a therapist. So trauma. So what happens with meditation? It's really interesting. It's not well understood, but it's very well documented that oftentimes when you start meditating, especially when you first start meditating, and your mind starts to quiet down, often out of the blue, old traumatic memories just sort of pop up. And for most of us who, if we don't have a whole lot of trauma in our background, it can be pretty minor. So for instance, I got into trouble back in fourth grade, and when I got sent to the principal's office, I was mortified, but nothing ever happened to it because I was a good girl, right? And so then, 15, 20 years later, when I first started meditating, I was sitting there meditating, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm back in the principal's office and feeling mortified. My cheeks were flushed. The whole thing is just like, because that was like a big traumatic memory for me, right? That I had just totally repressed. And so it's not a big deal. I could laugh at it because obviously nothing had ever happened because of that incident. But obviously, for people who have serious trauma in their background, you're sitting there meditating, all of a sudden, boom, there's you're back in your trauma. So definitely you want to proceed with caution. And like I said, you want to work with do not do it on your own. Work with a therapist, work with someone who knows what they're doing so they can help you prepare and sort of guide you in a way that's so you're not going to re-traumatize yourself.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Everyone, that'll be all the questions we can answer for today. And so we're going to wrap up. And thanks again, Sarah. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining.